Imagine walking through your front door and being welcomed home by a complete stranger. Except they aren't welcoming at all. In fact, they're screaming at you, telling you to get out of their house. Bewildered, you look around and notice that all of your furniture, decorations, everything is gone, replaced with what must be this person's things. You yell back at them, demanding that they leave, but it's useless. They make it clear that they aren't going anywhere. Unsure what else to do, you pull out your phone and call 911. But when the police arrive, it's not the stranger that they drag away in handcuffs, it's you. This sounds like something that would only happen in nightmares, but the reality is, in fact, much worse. There are many recent cases of people having their homes stolen from them, and somehow it's legal. In this video, we will investigate the worst of these real-life horror stories, one of which ends with someone not only having their home taken away from them, but their life as well. And by the end, you will understand how this keeps happening and if there's any way out. It was mid-March when an intense standoff between a New York homeowner and a stranger living on her property was caught on camera by ABC Eyewitness News, an encounter that would have consequences not just for the victim, but for the entire state.
You shouldn't be trying to steal my house. Yes, you are.
So, how did this viral moment come to pass? Well, it all started when Adele Andaloro's parents passed away, and she inherited a $1 million problem. Adele had been passed down her family home, and it was an inheritance she planned to sell. But that's the funny thing about plans. They never go as expected. After all, when the 47-year-old went to visit the $1 million property in February, she realized that not only was she locked out, but there was someone else inside. Yes, in the property's temporarily abandoned state, an alleged squatter, or rather, squatters, had made themselves more than at home, from claiming empty rooms to replacing the front door and adding new locks. However, when it came to retaliation, Adele's hands were tied. See, if someone was a tenant of a building, as these alleged squatters claimed to be, in the state of New York, it's illegal for the property owner to turn off utilities or change the locks. And that meant Adele was legally stuck on the outside looking in. Or at least she was until Eyewitness News entered the scene. And in one alleged squatter's rush to avoid interrogation, they left the door unlocked. Finally, Adele and the news station were able to enter the home that rightfully belonged to her. However, as they soon realized, they weren't alone.
There's a man sleeping right there.
They found two men in the home, one of whose inhabitancy was a recent development.
I moved in about 2 days ago.
Soon enough, police were called to the property on Adele. According to the alleged squatters, the homeowner was trespassing. However, considering Adele had the deed to the property, her claims weren't taken seriously by law enforcement. Instead, police cuffed the alleged squatter that had said he'd been at the home for 2 days and took him to the station and escorted the other squatter off of the property. Yet, less than 10 minutes later, just after Adele had the locks changed, the home was broken into again. One of the alleged squatters was back, along with a man who claimed to be leasing the home, Brian Rodriguez. Again, the police were called on Adele, and this time they weren't going to be so helpful. An officer informed Adele that this was considered a landlord-tenant dispute and was therefore out of law enforcement's jurisdiction. A loophole it seemed Brian was all too aware of.
If you own this house, you would not want her inside.
I don't own the house. I don't own this.
Exactly,
yes.
She does.
Yes, but then once again, you should know how the law works.
Instead, Adele would have to go to housing court to settle the matter. After all, Brian claimed he had signed a lease in October. He was just hesitant to show with whom.
Show us the proof.
But who are you for me to show? I showed it to cops.
Dan with Channel 7 News. If you don't want to show it, you don't want to show it.
Cool. Come here, brother. I like that.
But what Brian showed Eyewitness News wasn't a lease.
This is a bill.
Specifically, it was a bill for work he claimed he'd done to the house. But despite also being unable to provide law enforcement with proof of a lease, Adele was the one who was arrested for changing the lock, which was legally considered unlawful eviction. So, without the police on her side, Adele was left with two options.
Either she pays me my money that I put into the house, pay me the money, and I'll leave, or send me to court, and we deal with the judge in court.
And while this might sound like an easy choice, it isn't. According to the Rent Stabilization Association, the housing court process takes an average of 20 months to resolve eviction cases. And Adele wasn't the only homeowner who's found themselves tied up in this legal process.
Squatters have victimized many New Yorkers who say something just has to be done.
Since March, New York, and specifically Queens, has been the setting for numerous viral squatting incidents. But what exactly are squatters? And, more importantly, What makes them so hard to get rid of? Trespassing and squatting are separated by one key factor: intention. The trespasser's intent is to gain access to a property that doesn't belong to them without the owner's knowledge. The squatter's intent is to do this and then to take ownership or residency. And this one difference means that while trespassing is illegal in New York, squatting can be a gray area. But why? Well, despite some misinformation floating around the internet, it's typically not due to the squatter gaining ownership of the property, also known as adverse possession.
I don't know who needs to hear this, but this is really important information considering we're going through an economic crisis. But big man, you can't just climb through somebody's window and then sit on the couch and then wait for them to get home that very same day and then say, this is my house now. It 100% don't work like that.
Yes, while squatters' rights and adverse possession are often used interchangeably, in reality, the latter is a rarely applied legal doctrine that only covers cases where a person openly lives in a home for a number of years, which in New York is 10. However, where the law gets tricky is when a squatter claims to have lived at a dwelling for 30 days or more, which in New York can make them entitled to tenant protections. In these cases, a property owner would need an eviction notice to get rid of these tenants, and the only way to secure that is through court. But while this law may seem nonsensical, it exists to stop landlords from displacing tenants without due notice.
They can't do that. You know why? Because you have rights as a resident who has been there for more than 30 days. Guess what they call those rights to make you too embarrassed to use them? Squatters' rights.
Yep. In most cases, squatters' rights are simply tenants' rights that exist to protect those who've lived in a home or unit for a certain period of time from being forcibly removed. Of course, that doesn't mean this law can't be weaponized against property owners.
Why can't you just change the locks?
Oh, I will be arrested instantly.
They turned off the hot water and then reported that they had no hot water. It's a $250 fine per day.
I'm not getting any rent, and I'm paying the gas and electric every month.
Recently, one TikToker even used his platform to endorse squatting.
The migrant influencer who has been encouraging migrants to come to the United States illegally and squat in the homes of U.S. citizens has been on the run from immigration authorities, the Post has learned.
That's right. In March, Venezuelan migrant Leonel Moreno took to the app to advise illegal immigrants to invade empty homes rather than live on the street. Again, seemingly equating squatters' rights to rarely applied adverse possession.
Que me enteré que existe una ley que dice que si una casa no está habitada, podemos expropiarla.
In the upload, the TikToker added that he has friends from Africa who have already taken about 7 homes in the US. According to the Columbus Dispatch, Leonel was arrested that same month by ICE in Ohio for entering the country illegally. Still, the video attracted backlash, as well as concern of what the migrants' advice might lead to.
Well, I think publicity, like what we're seeing in TikTok and viral videos of that nature, are going to magnify the idea that squatting is an alternative to not having enough housing.
After all, with the horror stories circulating online, it seemed Americans already had a problem on their hands. Take, for example, the case of Susanna and Joseph Landa. In October, the couple bought their dream home in Queens, with hopes to retire next door to family in order to have a better support system for their son with Down syndrome. However, the 3-bedroom, 4-bathroom, $2 million purchase came with one unadvertised feature: a house guest who refused to leave. Yes, despite the Landas giving Brett Flores 10 days notice upon learning he was residing in the home, the squatter was the one who called the cops when the two 68-year-olds tried to enter the home they owned with an insurance inspector.
They cannot come here early when I'm not here. They have keys.
But why did the 32-year-old feel entitled to the property? Well, that goes back to the previous owner of the property, a man named Bernard Fernandez. See, once upon a time, Bernard was living the high life in New York City as the VP for E-Gluck Corporation, one of the biggest wristwatch manufacturers in the world. However, with age, Bernie's health plummeted as brain bleeding and the beginnings of dementia took their toll. So, the former wristwatch executive purchased the home in Queens to live out the remainder of his days. And in 2019, he even hired a caretaker, someone he'd allegedly been introduced to through a relative, Brett Flores. At the time, Brett was living in LA. However, he relocated to New York to look after the ailing Bernard. In an interview with the New York Post, a source who had been in a relationship with Bernie at the time described Brett as very charming and a positive force in the former wristwatch executive's life, at least at first. However, after Brett was hired full-time and moved into the Queens property in July 2020, a promotion that came with a handsome $3,000 a week salary, the source noticed a change in the 32-year-old's behavior. Security cameras allegedly captured Brett driving off from the property in Bernie's luxury cars and leaving the sickly homeowner alone for hours when the partner was out of town. It was also around this time that posts on social media caught the source's attention. Photos allegedly captured Brett wearing really high-end watches that the partner knew belonged to Bernard. And while Brett's primary task was supposed to be taking care of the wristwatch executive, his focus seemed to be elsewhere, whether it was a campaign with men's designer swimwear brand Park & Ronan, further modeling opportunities and risque shoots, or allegedly hobnobbing with gay celebrities at nightclubs. But before Bernard's partner could express his concern about the person they had invited into their lives, he was cut out. In October 2020, Brett allegedly had Bernard sign an order of protection that prevented the partner from entering the home or contacting Bernard again. Brett also allegedly filed a similar order against him. "My hands are tied legally. It was just horrible," the source told the Post. "Bernard was very vulnerable. I don't know what happened when I was not in the house, but ultimately, Brett became his whole world. After that, close friends were allegedly exiled from the home, as Brett isolated Bernard completely, and so the partner was forced to stay out of Bernard's life. Well, mainly. See, he was still the former wristwatch executive's emergency contact, and that meant he often received calls from doctors regarding Bernard's health. And in December 2022, he received a disturbing update. The pharmacist was overly concerned because his insulin had not been picked up, the source claimed. He didn't know if Bernard ever received the medicine. However, according to the partner, he received another call a month later from the hospital, where he was allegedly told that neither Brett nor the person who had Bernard's power of attorney could be reached. He claimed he was asked by the hospital to come be with Bernard. However, as the source told the Post, "Having the experience that I've had, I couldn't even go." And so that night, at 80 years old, Bernard Fernandez passed away in the hospital, alone. "I lost the man that I love, and I couldn't do anything to save him," the source told the Post. But as those who'd known the wristwatch executive tried to move on, Brett stayed put. Yes, despite not being a tenant.
How can you have rights if you have no lease, you're not paying rent? So what is your right?
Brett claimed that before Bernard passed away, he had given him a license to stay in the house. And that meant Brett had the liberty not only to live in the home, but to list the rooms inside for rent, which was exactly what he was doing. As for his plan for keeping what he believed he was owed, well, it seemed that Brett was willing to resort to any means necessary. After all, the former caregiver wasn't a male model on the side, but an aspiring actor who, in an interview with Homme Manifesto magazine, described his dream role as a villain who has some ridiculous plan for world domination. And cameras or no cameras, for the Landas, Brett was playing the part to a T. By February, the couple had been to 5 different hearings at civil court, with no resolution.
He filed the bankruptcy, so that prevents everything from going forward.
Meanwhile, since it was illegal for the property owners to turn off utilities on their tenant, welcome or not, the Landas were still stuck footing the bills.
Our system is broken. We have no rights. We have no rights at all.
And since the couple has begun the long legal process of suing Brett in order to have him evicted, the former caretaker has responded by suing the couple for harassment, something he claimed to have audio proof of despite failing to provide this evidence in court. As Brett's attorney boldly stated,
"The revelation will turn this narrative on its head. The homeowner, the Landaus, are not victims in this case."
The attorney, however, didn't elaborate as to why this would be the case, aside from hinting that the house was listed for $2.6 million and they bought it for $2 million.
Regardless of what they paid for the house, they have the deed to it. Why is your client still inside their home?
Because I'm suggesting there's a connection and story behind the reduction in sale price. And we'll give a more detailed response in a later date.
For their part, the Landas insisted they paid what the bank had asked for. But while Brett may still not have handed over the dirt he claimed to have on the couple, his own criminal history has surfaced.
Court records also show Brett Flores, who also goes by Brett Fisher, was arrested for assault and harassment in an unrelated case in that home in question.
Yes, Brett was facing DV charges for an incident in December that allegedly occurred inside the home between himself and his wife. That's right, Brett was married. And not only that, but together the two had a child, a sickly child. In fact, on the night in question, Brett and his wife were allegedly arguing over their kid who was in the hospital when things became physical. Still, these details, however scandalous, fail to answer the question at the heart of this story. Why wouldn't Brett leave?
Mr. Flores, why won't you just move out? Seems pretty simple.
My lawyers are speaking on my behalf.
But before we get to Brett's attorney's response, let's take a look at the situation another Queens couple had become entangled in just a few boroughs over. After spending $530,000 renovating their Lakeside Avenue investment property in Jamaica, Queens, and finding tenants to fill the empty rooms, Denise Curliand and Julia Fullman were likely to reap the rewards of their hard work. Fate, however, had something else in store. See, on March 5th, the couple's real estate broker, Ionia Bardi, went to check on the $930,000 duplex, only to realize that the locks had been changed. Then, Ionia saw a hooded figure through the window holding a drill, and it seemed the occupant had noticed the broker as well, because when she went to her car to call the police, the man, along with others, exited the home and encircled the vehicle. "They were trying to intimidate me," she told the Daily Mail. When the police arrived, two of the men claimed they'd been living in the duplex since January, despite them allegedly not being there when Ionia was at the property the previous day with a housing inspector. The men who claimed to live in the duplex, Rondi L. Francis and Lance Hunt, had no proof of residency, and after telling cops they were YouTubers, they left the property peacefully. Yet, when the homeowners and broker expressed their intent to acquire new locks, police told them they'd be arrested, the same way Adele had been for unlawful eviction. The men came back the next day, this time with a lease signed by the broker, with her name spelled incorrectly. They were escorted off of the property by police, and despite the previous warning the property owners had received, they changed the locks. Then, once inside the apartment, the owners of the almost $1 million duplex were faced with the aftermath the squatters had left. The walls of the newly renovated property were scratched, the floors were scuffed, and the smell of cannabis still floated through the home despite the absence of visitors. Yes, Dennis and Julia had a mess to clean up, and it wasn't just limited to inside the duplex. See, 10 days later, Ionia Bardi was served with court documents that announced the broker, along with her clients and the real estate company, Top Nest Properties, were being sued by Rondi L. Francis and Lance Hunt for illegally kicking them out of the property they claimed to be renting. In an attempt to prove that they had resided in the property long enough for squatters' rights to kick in, they filed evidence with Queens County Court. This proof included an approval of the rental application, a lease, this time with Ionia's name spelled correctly, and a receipt from Shake Shack for $25.27 delivered to the address. But despite their claim that they paid a security deposit and first month's rent, amounting to an alleged $4,000, according to what the co-owner of the property, Dennis Curryland, told the Post, everything they presented was fraudulent and clearly photoshopped. You can't really even blame them in a way because it's handed to them on a silver platter, Dennis, the co-owner, said in another interview with the Post. Something needs to be done because the issue is getting worse. People are taking advantage of these laws, manipulating the laws, and our hands are tied. What did we do? Nothing. We put up a property for rent and that's it. Now we're dealing with a nightmare. There's more to this story that we'll get to soon. But now that we're on the subject of nightmares, it seemed another property owner in Queens was facing their own. See, while Dennis Curryland and Julia Fullman squatters might have left their duplex with a few scratches and scuffs, the aftermath was nothing compared to what Corey Elder was capable of. The 43-year-old had a knack for making spaces unrecognizable. At least, that's what his alleged recent work in an apartment in the Rockaways suggested. Yes, like any good interior designer, Corey allegedly added his personal touches throughout the unit, including feces, illegal substances, adult material, license plates from various states, and clothing with tags that hadn't been removed. Then there were the statement pieces, which reportedly included an entire car hood in the living room. And, of course, what made the apartment a home were the pets, namely 11 dogs and 2 cats, all of which were emaciated and in clear distress. Unsurprisingly, The homeowner, who asked to remain anonymous, in their interview with the Post, wasn't pleased with the development. After all, when she left for her 5-day Memorial Day vacation, the apartment had been empty, and when she came back, well, not so much. The first tip-off that something wasn't right was the car parked in the backyard, which notably didn't have a driveway. And then there was the state of the apartment itself. There is dog poop all over the floor, she said. It is sickening. Every step you take is poop. According to the property owner, Corey broke into the unit through the window in May, and since then, it had been a full house, complete with pets, his girlfriend, and their 2 kids. Security cameras had been ripped out of the walls and electricity to the adjoining apartment had been cut, making the unit unlivable in the winter. But while the homeowner was adamant the accused squatters hadn't been in the unit 5 days ago, when the police spoke with the girlfriend, she claimed they'd been living there for 3 months. And, as with the cases we've previously discussed, that was all it took for the issue to enter the court system. This could have held the eviction process up for months, if not years. That is, if it weren't for the intervention that occurred in March. But we'll get to that after our last story, a case that shows just how quickly these hostile confrontations can become something much darker.
That breaking news on Manhattan's East Side, a woman in her 50s found dead in her apartment, stuffed into a duffel bag.
It was still winter when Nadia Vitel had returned to New York from her Europe trip, and as a result, back to real life. Or rather, back to her new life. See, Nadia had decided to move into her late mother's apartment to start the next chapter of adulthood. And that meant when the 52-year-old pulled up to the Manhattan address in her Lexus SUV, with her dog in tow on the morning of March 12th, she was officially on some of the first pages of the next segment of a book that, unknown to her, was already nearing its end. After all, Nadia never left apartment 19A, at least not that day, and not the day after that either. And it wasn't long before family members who couldn't reach Nadia grew concerned. So, on March 14th, the building superintendent, along with Nadia's nearest and dearest, entered the unit. Upon walking into the apartment, there was only one visible occupant of the unit, Nadia's dog. There was, however, a smashed wall in the bedroom, the possible sign of struggle. Eventually, their search of the unit brought them to Nadia's closet, where they discovered a duffel bag. According to the superintendent, Jean Pompey, they then called the fire department.
He directed them to the closet, because all the clothes had been pulled down. And he said there was a bag underneath it, and he said, can you open the bag, because I believe there's a body in there.
And there were the remains of a person inside the duffel bag, the same person the group had been searching for, and now, the last one they wanted to see.
There was a family out here who, I guess, maybe found someone in the apartment, I'm not really sure. It seemed very, not a great situation, and they seemed pretty shaken up by it.
Yes, for her loved ones, the loss of Nadia was likely indescribable. After all, she was the kind of person who opened up her own garage as storage for her son's business venture, a story that had previously been featured on CBS 2 in 2021.
I kind of gave in into this. The original thought was no way.
And now that same son was attesting to his mother's generosity at her funeral.
Not only does she deep down support my entrepreneurship crazy venture idea, but she helped fund it early on.
But what had happened to Nadia? To no surprise given the way she was found, the 52-year-old's death was ruled a murder. The cause? Blunt force trauma to the head. As for who was responsible, well, as security footage would suggest, Nadia wasn't the only one in the apartment that day, nor was she alone on the days leading up to her passing. See, on March 10th, just hours after Nadia dropped off items at her new apartment, 2 unidentified individuals entered the luxury building, bringing a pink suitcase with them. Over the next 2 days, they were captured entering and exiting the building multiple times. Then, on March 12th, the same day Nadia was last seen, the pair entered the building at 3 p.m. with a key. Credit card information would later show they had just returned from Target, where they used Nadia's card to buy another suitcase. The duo appeared on security footage one last time around 6 p.m.
Building staff told me they saw on surveillance video the suspected killer couple leaving the lobby here, smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world.
They had both their old and recently purchased suitcase, toilet paper, and a Target bag. They were also, notably, wearing blue gloves. The unidentified persons then walked to Nadia's vehicle.
And they got in and drove away.
Yes, according to law enforcement, The two suspects, who they believe took Nadia's life, have been squatting in her apartment for days before taking her life. And with these unidentified individuals still on the run, this manhunt was about to venture outside of state lines.
It's believed that they drove her car across the George Washington Bridge, into New Jersey, and then into Pennsylvania, where they crashed the vehicle.
But more on that in a moment. In response to citizens' growing fears of squatters, 4 states have taken legislative action to give homeowners more power in these situations.
Squatter rights? Oxymoron. Squatters have no right.
This includes New York, where changes to legislation were made by both the state assembly,
the bill is passed,
and the state senate,
the bill is passed,
to exclude squatters from tenant protections and make it easier for police to intervene.
That means that if you do not have permission from the rightful owner, title, right to be on a premises, then you are no longer afforded the tenancy rights you were just the day before.
These changes were all thanks to a few viral stories that drew the government's attention to the issue.
How did it get in there in the first place?
So we fought really hard. A bunch of the investigative reporters like yourself who elevated the stories and the nightmares people are facing showed the leadership in our government that we need to make a change.
But it wasn't just government officials that had media coverage to thank for the changes. See, the wheels of justice may turn slow, but they do in fact turn. The last time we talked about Adele Andaloro, she was being arrested for changing the locks to her home, which in the eyes of the law was unlawful eviction. However, after Adele's story went viral, Queens DA Melinda Katz saw to it that the charges against the homeowner were dropped, and further charges were issued against one of the home's occupants.
You can't walk into a house that's not yours and claim you have a right to be there. I thank the media for all the attention that they have given to this story and for being here today, because I do think it's an important message to send.
If convicted, Brian Rodriguez could face up to 15 years behind bars. But while he was ordered to stay out of Adele's home, it hadn't just been him occupying the $1 million estate. No, he'd been acting as the unofficial landlord for the property, and had even rented rooms to tenants who were still there.
I was brought into a real estate. I have receipts and everything. This is insane. I'm not a squatter. I don't even know what that word means.
However, after learning that Adele's squatter saga was still unfolding,
the sooner I can get these people out, the better.
The Queens DA, Melinda Katz, called the homeowner to inform her that action was going to be taken.
So they cleaned the house?
Bravo!
She hired a locksmith, and I think she's having the house cleaned as we speak.
Similarly, the Queens DA also took a stand in Duplex owners Dennis Kurland and Julia Fullman's unlawful eviction case by hitting the supposed mastermind of the lawsuit, Lance White Hunt, back with an 18-count indictment. You cannot claim rights to a home that you have entered illegally, Melinda Katz said in a response to the squatters' lawsuit. My office will not allow individuals to capitalize on the confusion surrounding squatters' rights for their own personal gain. Lance was arrested on May 13th, and if found guilty, he could face up to 15 years in jail. As for Lance's suit against the couple, well, that was dismissed with prejudice by the judge. Another satisfying conclusion for humans and animals alike was met in the pet and junk hoarding case after squatter Corey Elder was arrested and charged with animal neglect and torture, as well as possession of an illegal substance and stolen property. The NYPD informed the public via Twitter that the animals were all taken to the ASPCA for evaluation and medical care. Given Corey's habit for theft, law enforcement believed at least some of the pets were stolen, and so far at least one dog has been returned to their rightful owner. Of course, despite the change in law, not every squatting case is so easily solved, especially not when the accused squatter lived in the home before the homeowner bought it, like former caretaker Brett Flores.
So that's not a clear-cut squatter case that would not be affected by the state law.
Since signing the deed in October, the Landas still haven't been able to move into their dream home that they bought from the nephew of the deceased owner, and instead, they've been forced to take celebrity security measures to ensure their property is protected.
The family has now hired a private security guy or guard to watch over their mansion, the same security guy who at one point in time provided protection for Bill Gates and his family.
As for why Brett was still holed up on the property, well, according to his lawyer, that came down to one incentive: cold, hard cash.
He needs the money to procure adequate housing for his family, and once he gets that money, there's nothing more he wants to do than leave.
According to the lawyer, the Landas agreed to pay Brett $140,000 for the sale of the home. But until he gets that money, he's willing to take this disagreement all the way to trial and let a jury decide his fate. Now we return to the case of Nadia Vitels. When we left off, the manhunt had led investigators to Pennsylvania, where local law enforcement had run a license plate number from a car crash and connected the vehicle to Nadia. After that, it wasn't long before the mother's accused killers were found, extradited, and at last, identified to the public.
U.S. Marshals arrested 19-year-old Hallie Tejada and 18-year-old Kensley Alston in York, Pennsylvania early Friday morning for allegedly possessing a stolen car.
Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston were then charged with second-degree murder, burglary, robbery, possession of stolen property, grand larceny, and concealment of a corpse. Before the pair was caught, they had gone on a shopping spree with Nadia's credit cards, purchasing basics such as food and clothing, along with pricier items like AirPods, a PS5, and even a diamond ring. Both of the accused murderers had a criminal history, with 18-year-old Kensley's records exposing a prior conviction for assault, and 19-year-old Hallie's records noting an arrest in December for breaking the glass door of his previous address. As for their employment, well, when it came to Hallie, even immediate family members were unsure.
Is he working right now?
I have no clue, to be honest with you.
But while the arrests might have been a minor victory in Nadia Vitel's case,
I feel satisfied with that because nothing more than justice for this woman.
the suspects have since pleaded not guilty.
Anything you want to say for yourself? Did you do it?
I'm innocent.
And considering the youth of one of the accused,
Alston was 17 years old at the time of the incident. She's being treated as a juvenile.
It's still uncertain whether Nadia's family will receive the justice they're looking for. After all, when it comes to squatters, these uninvited guests are just as adept at squeezing through opened windows and barely ajar doors as they are at legal loopholes. Yet, since new squatting laws have taken effect in New York,
your largest investment is your home. That's your largest investment.
It seems these viral incidents have paved the way for real change.
If we don't voice these issues like this in the news, then none of this may have ever elevated to being a part of the New York State budget.
As for whether this legislation will crack down on criminals,
playing on your screen now are 4 of the 8 suspects that were under arrest being walked out one by one from police.
Require tweaking for more complex cases,
There shouldn't be a problem, and it becomes a nightmare.
or have the unintended consequence of allowing landlords to more easily evict legal tenants by wrongly classifying them as squatters.
If they're not squatters' rights, they're your rights.
This and more will be revealed as the legislation is tested out.
As of right now, if someone moves into your home, a stranger in the middle of the night with any lease or claim to your property, police can arrest them possibly for trespassing instead of having to take them through housing court.
This is the story of squatters' rights in America, a legal loophole that might just be closing in. If you have more topics you'd like us to dive into, leave a comment below and consider subscribing to stay updated. And while you're here, consider checking out our other video about property concerns, this one about Airbnb nightmares.